Hello there. In this video I will analyse, comment and conclude on the following question. Does Final Fantasy XIV suffer from content drought? Let's have a gander. So where does the term content drought in relation to Final Fantasy XIV come from? Well, to start off with, it's not a new term that the game has suddenly received. It is a renewed piece of criticism that often occurs around patch updates and raid cycles where said content in said patch is considered minimal and quick to complete, thus returning to the cycle of, and I quote, nothing to do until the next major patch. Combine that with the delayed release of the Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker expansion, which at the current time is 6 months away from going live, and you've got all of the conditions for the term content drought to come into play within the Final Fantasy XIV community. Now, looking back, you can find a plethora of content creation videos and posts regarding the concept of content drought, dating all the way back to 2017. Some of these videos take a comedic stance on the topic, such as Larry Zar's 2018 Content Drought FFXIV video, where he makes light of the rationale and types. Final Fantasy XIV is the only game I play, where is the content? Which in my opinion is in relation to players who consume content rapidly and then complain that there is no more content to do. All the way up to Desperius' 2021 My Issues with FFXIV's content video, where in a smaller section of the video criticises the game's theme park content cycle and lack of innovation regarding gameplay mechanics. However, this video overall is a little confusing and has conflicting statements in places, so take that as you may. Now, there are two major points of reference regarding content drought lore. One is the statement by Naoki Yoshida, the game's head producer, when answering a question from a player in an interview at Gamescom. Now, the player asked, and I'm going to paraphrase here, I love this game, but there is a lack of content and motivation for me to play, in which Yoshida responds, it's okay not to play every day, it's just a game, quit and come back later. This was one of the major points that backed up the meta of Final Fantasy XIV being a casual MMORPG that does not support a hardcore playstyle regarding longevity, which is something we will come back to when I go over my thoughts and the data from you, the community. The second point of reference for content drought lore would be the shift in priority for PvE content. An example of this would be the new ultimate of the current expansion being cancelled, which caused a stir in the raiding community and the realization that the game would no longer be able to provide an ultimate at every odd patch, instead moving to a schedule of 2 ultimate encounters per expansion. And of course there are many more examples which I would love to hear in the comment section below, maybe the reduction of dungeon content in each patch over time, or Deep Dungeon not having a new version released, and so on. Let me know what you feel adds to the label of content drought below. So what do you folks within the Final Fantasy XIV community think? We'll look at the results of the poll and some feedback comments. So let's first take a look at the 2 polls that were put up on social media. So one from YouTube and one from Twitter. So the survey says, does Final Fantasy XIV have a content drought problem? So if we go based on the Twitter one, we have about 54% saying yes it does, 35% saying no, 10% saying other, and then in contrast we have the YouTube one with 45 votes, and a little bit of a reverse actually. So yes, there is a content drought at 44%, and no, there is not a content drought at 47%. It's certainly interesting to see that difference between that and YouTube as well. Now let's look at some of the comments. So we will go to the Twitter comments first. So we've got one here. Sometimes you got to make your own content. 6 months is plenty of time for screenshots, role-playing and shitposting. So this chap's on about 6 months until the expansion. So the current quote-unquote content drought. Pepper in some actual playtime and you're set. So again, this kind of goes against some stuff I'm saying where yes, you can role-play and do silly stuff in the game. And that does mitigate against the content drought. Second one here, this problem is relative, dependent on how quickly one consumes said content. Personally, I don't think it's a good idea to focus all of your gaming habits around one title. You will I suck at this word. You will inevitably say it in an action voice and become disappointed. Yeah, good point. Something that, I align with as well. If you're gonna zerg out the hours on a game like this, you are going to run out of stuff very quickly. Next up, we've got I voted other because the answer is both yes and no. When you try to do everything or nearly everything in the game, no. If you are focused on one thing, yes. Yeah, I resonate with that quite a bit. I just think that design content with longevity in mind. So this one is more towards making content that can last a long time, probably towards the PvE aspects is what I'm assuming. So again, horizontal progression, Mythic Plus, little systems like that could help with the PvE system to give it a bit more longevity in the grand scheme of things, difficult dungeons and stuff like that. The content cycle is a very robust way of putting out content and players know what they're getting. But even if there is content, it feels like a drought for many players. I wish XIV would focus a tad more on horizontal progression. Yes, I also agree with that. I think they're getting better at horizontal progression. So they've definitely been pushing more into the mount aspect of the game. So you can get quite a few rare mounts now from either achievement hunting, PvP, stuff like that. So hopefully that will become a reoccurring theme as the game goes on. Next we have It Always Has had a content drought, which is why the Shield of Yoshida said it's okay to unsub is so popular. That's something we make reference to in this discussion as well. Yoshida saying that if you want to quit. From the Gamescom interview. It's also not just a raving problem, all types of content go through droughts. Playing FF every day is unviable unless you are a strictly social player or heavily addicted. So playing FF every day is unviable unless you're strictly a social player or heavily addicted. Yeah, that's true. So if you love every single mode of the game and you're a hardcore achievement hunter, you will probably get the most out of it. And if you're a social player, which is a bit more like I am nowadays, you are going to get a lot of run for your money. But if you are getting week 1 clears and focusing only on raiding, you are going to run into that drought quite a lot. So those were the Twitter comments. Let's go and take a look at the YouTube comments. As someone who's only been playing for 6 months, there's a ton of stuff for me, but for those who've been playing for years, yeah, if you're a new player to Final Fantasy XIV, you will not run into a content drought anytime soon. So if you're new to the game, welcome. You don't have to worry about this at all. You've got a lot of fun stuff you can be doing, and man, I wish I could feel that first new MMO feeling, maybe with New World or Ashes of Creation, we'll see, but hopefully you enjoy FFXIV, my friend. The problem is not the amount, but the overall quality and the lack of replayability. Yeah, that's just a problem of the type of raid design this game has. Once you kill the boss, you don't need to kill it again. You've killed it. So you're only killing it to get more gear and driving things that aren't officially in the game, such as FF logs or parsing. So, that is to be said with the game. Of course it does, it goes without saying, and realistically, that's not the fault of the developers. I feel they made the right choice to focus on the expansion and what's to come, rather than what's out now. Considering the pains they've gone through in this past year, so COVID and all that sort of stuff, there's no easy answer to every expectation currently, but that doesn't mean there isn't a flood of content that's been floating around for years now. So he's making reference to Deep Dungeons, so Palace of the Dead, Heaven on High, PvP, Triple Triad, Blue Mage, basically all the content that's in the game other than raiding is what this person is stating. And a slew more that may not be new but are still around and have barely been touched. So yeah, that makes contrast and a reference to everything except for raiding. There is a lot of stuff to do. NGL, so not going to lie, personally I think there's a ton of content. Nowadays we rush through content, so we feel there's not enough to do. I agree. New Southern Front Bozja area available. 1-2 days later people are max level and they said they're done with the content but haven't unlocked certain game mechanics such as hunts and all this other sort of stuff. As a veteran player myself, every piece of new content is fun for sure, but sprouts that have just reached max level often don't even know how much stuff there is to do. So instead they cry for new stuff. So maybe that's a message with how Final Fantasy says, you have all this stuff to do. So maybe they do, maybe they don't. I haven't, I haven't been in the situation where I've hit a fresh level 17 in this game for a while, but certainly if that player experience isn't being linked in, it is part of a bigger issue. And that wraps up the comments. So thank you again for voting and putting in your comments. They were really good to read. Both sides of the fence there and some in between the fence, which it was good to get not just my opinion on it, to get what you folks in the community think, so it's not just my own rant. But yes, rapidly moving on. Now, what are my thoughts? I have gone from one end of the spectrum, playing 25 to 30 hours a week with a focus on raid progression, to now raiding 4 hours a week and playing around 5 hours total per week in the space of 3 years. Now, ask me 3 years ago as a semi-hardcore raider regarding today's content drought debate, and I'm going to tell you that absolutely the game suffers from content drought, which affects the mid-core and above raiding community and those who specialize in raid progression and PvE. Ask me today as the casual boomer I am, and I still have plenty of content to do. Our static is progressing phase 2 of E12S with our 4-hour weekly progression, so even once we clear and farm the final raid encounter, I will still have additional content to catch up on, such as the Southern Front and Achievement System, which are 2 gameplay systems out of the many more that remain that I enjoy the most. If I had to simplify my thoughts on the topic of content drought, I would say the following 2 statements. 1. As a player who raids above mid-core and focuses primarily on raiding, there is a noticeable content drought. This scales up more the higher group type you are, such as semi-hardcore and hardcore group styles. If you put a lot of hours into Final Fantasy XIV on a weekly basis, you will run out of PvE content at a fast rate. 2. As a player who games casually and enjoys most gameplay systems that Final Fantasy XIV has to offer, there is little to no content drought. I can attest to this as somebody with a 4 to 5 hour per week playtime who enjoys and spends time on multiple aspects of the game. Now those are 2 extremes of the curve, and you will have a transition from A to B that factors in different hours spent playing per week, followed by the activity the player is doing and what they actually enjoy doing the most. So for example, role players make their own content, and as somebody who has had a laugh with friends and visited roleplay housing and estate bars, it is understandable that roleplay content is self-serving and mitigates heavily against content drought. Now when comparing my personal thoughts with the data from the community polls and comments, the feedback and results do align with my original line of thinking, which is that content drought's existence is dependent on what type of content the player consumes. So, in conclusion, does Final Fantasy XIV as an MMORPG suffer from content drought? No, it does not. But does Final Fantasy XIV suffer from content drought within its combat and raid gameplay design? Then yes it does. Final Fantasy XIV is a casual MMORPG that encourages a casual playstyle, and the game has diminishing returns on playing hardcore with huge time investments when it comes to its combat and raid gameplay design. This is unlikely to change in the future, so if you are looking for an MMORPG to invest countless hours in with a focus on endgame combat and being rewarded for those hardcore investments of time, then Final Fantasy XIV is not the MMORPG for you. Investing hardcore amounts of time into the PvE gameplay design will give you the rewards earlier, true, but stop the gameplay loop right at that moment, leading into, and yep, you guessed it, a content drought. However, if you are looking for an MMORPG where you can play at a set pace and still progress without falling behind, then Final Fantasy XIV is that game. You can achieve the same result at a slower pace and still reach the highest point of the mountain with the hardcore players, with the only factor being time. And as I said before, this is due to diminishing returns and how the game has been designed. And that's it. Thank you again for tuning in, voting and sending your comments on this topic. And I would be interested to see what you think in the comments, so please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. For now, I am out.